Let me thank a couple of institutions and individuals for supporting this research. It is Armenian Studies Center in Michigan, and another institution is ASCN, Academic Caucasus, Swiss Caucasus Network, EHESS in Paris, and those individuals who supported this research in all kind of ways. The Dr. Arasanjan, a director of Armenian Studies in Michigan, and Claire Mouradian and Claude Moutafian, Sophie Oman, and sure. Actually, the aim of this paper is to contribute to the debate on pogroms and forced migration, trauma, and healing of traumatic memory. Based on empirical data obtained from ethnographic fieldwork and biographical interviews in 4 countries, the paper explores the gender aspects of belonging and the nature of forced migration in the context of deprived condition in the host societies. The study combines a comparative dimension as well as micro-level perspectives through the longitudinal research, numerous interviews with the former refugees, IDPs in Nagorno-Karabakh Republic, Armenia, Russia, and US. These comparisons include reintegration processes in 4 countries, 4 mentioned countries. Second, transgenerational aspects of multiple traumas through the prism of 3 generations of women. And third, urban-rural parameters. The key questions to be examined are: what are the phases of gender trauma after the collapse of the USSR, and what strategies and coping mechanisms use refugees, IDPs, families, 3 generations of women in order to heal trauma and transform traumatic memory. Have they become integrated into their hosting societies or remained excluded, expatriate? There was a forced migration in connection with the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict. The conflict over Nagorno-Karabakh created an unregulated, chaotic, and often bloody exchange of populations among Armenia, Azerbaijan, and Nagorno-Karabakhska Autonomna Oblast, later de facto Nagorno-Karabakh Republic. On the Azerbaijani side, the conflict created more than 700,000 refugees and IDPs, and an estimate 350,000 ethnic Armenians fled Azerbaijan in 2 waves in 1988 and 1990 after anti-Armenian violence in many directions, mostly for Armenia, Nagorno-Karabakh, Russia, and the US. I'm skipping Ukraine because I didn't have fieldwork over there. The exchange of populations between Armenia and Azerbaijan took place before the military phase of the conflict. In that period, there were also cases of Armenian-Azerbaijani property exchange. My research questions: Armenians from Azerbaijan are considered in specialized ethnographic literature as one of the most cosmopolitan subcultural groups. During the Armenian-Azerbaijani conflict of 1988-1994, they had been subjected to numerous pogroms which are considered mini-genocides. This caused a trauma that has specific gender aspects. However, when they fled to the more or less culturally similar environment, instead of recovering from the trauma, they got a repetition of it. I argue that Armenians from Azerbaijan have undergone through multiple trauma experience, both as a result of hostile radical nationalism with genocidal intentions and intra-group tension, thus getting multiple and intersectional traumas. Related literature, very quickly. Towards the end of the 20th century in particular, regional conflicts have taken a terrible toll on populations. With these developments, the literature on war refugees and IDPs has increased. In particular, there is a growing emphasis on the impact of war on women. In most countries, women from the center of the family and bear the economic and social burden of keeping their families together throughout times of upheaval and during post-conflict reconstruction. The literature emphasizes a number of concerns. First, conceptual problems and mere double standards. Secondly, and in publication, I mean in version for publication, I'm going to unpack all this. I'm sorry, this is just because of the pressure of 15 minutes. Secondly is the generation gap in the coping of trauma. The third problematic angle is the refugees' reaction to their victimization and marginalization. The most relevant for this analysis is the bulk of literature that examines refugees' resocialization and reintegration in Russia as a result of forced migration engendered by ethnic conflict, not only in Russia, in 4 countries, In this respect, it is noteworthy that while conflict in Eastern Europe, including the resulting gender experiences, have been explored in academic literature, in particular experiences and conflict in the Balkans. A social reintegration perspective of refugees on the war over Nagorno-Karabakh has remained largely absent. This is partly because discussion on the ethnic conflict focus on the causes and the conflict itself. Although there is an emerging body of literature which focuses on post-conflict developments in the Nagorno-Karabakh Republic, the refugees' social integration realities in Azerbaijan, Armenia, and Karabakh post-war societies are hardly addressed. I just included Azerbaijan because I wanted to be a little bit balanced, as there are a couple of articles on the issue. Upon incorporating the impact of migration processes on post-conflict gender roles and relations into my analysis, it can be deduced that in academic scholarship, gendered migration is largely discussed in terms of causing contradictory experiences. Displacement and resettlement due to conflict often lead to shifts in gender roles and responsibilities for both women and men, sometimes to women's benefit and sometimes to their further marginalizations. Women, for example, may suffer from an added work burden, and at the same time they may also experience more community control in the absence of their husbands, caused by labor migration or death, and thus experience more oppression in everyday life. Similarly, like our research participants in 4 ethnographic sites, local women in other post-conflict regions also experience marginalization. So trauma narratives. So as I told, I took 6 families and 3 generations of women in these families, and trauma narratives. I just tried. There were like about 5 narratives I just I just saw like all of these people. Despite where they live, they just come back to this topic over and over. So, trauma of loss. This is the biggest narrative, and I will just stop on a couple of that, and in their version for publication, I will unpack that. So, materiality, and so in this section, I will talk about materiality and pragmatics of social suffering. Material forces are deeply implicated in social suffering, says Jeffrey Alexander in his theoretical book on trauma. Trying to understand how many challenges, trying to understand how a cultural process channels powerful human emotions and to what effect newly obtained attitude to possession can be discussed. Laura from Russia teaches her daughter Karine, no need to buy anything, no furniture or pottery. One needs only portable and hidden possessions. Otherwise, perpetrators will attack. One is too vulnerable. Eagerness to earn, this was quotation, eagerness to earn portable capital because of the trauma of losses of possession hardly earned in the context, in the time of Soviet scarcity, is mentioned virtually in every interview. Lida from Lansing in the US was talking about her tablecloths in Baku, describing every detail of the embroidery on it. Laura was doing the same, talking about her 3 daughters' dowries robbed in Azerbaijan by pogroms, perpetrators, and whatever she was able to rescue was annihilated during the bombardments in her ancestral home in Karabakh, the site of her initial migration. Again, Laura cannot forget that every single item of her 3 daughters' dowries conflated with great difficulties in the context of minimalistic Soviet material culture, and those specific images in her mind chronically haunting her psyche. A substantial part of that material loss is hardly tangible, because this is about the long-term investments both at the ethnic Azerbaijani and Armenians' weddings and funeral ceremonies. The interruption and loss of the stable long-term relationships and regular exchanges cause the loss of economic defters, so-called defters, and different types of cultural capitals. It was aggravated by the almost complete loss of human capital. I mean the professionalization of Azerbaijani Armenian in Armenia, Nagorno-Karabakh Republic, and in Russia, in some parts of Russia, during the harsh social competition and linguistic chauvinism. As mentioned above, unspoken horrors many witnessed were poorly documented. The interviews are so far unique testimonies that tells a gripping personal account of Armenian refugees whose families, along with more than 200,000 other Armenians, were displaced from different Azerbaijani cities and towns, mostly from Baku, and struggled to adjust in crisis-riven Armenia, mostly Yerevan. I was absolutely political to choose one family with this three generation women in Yerevan, in capital city, and another family, second family in Masis region in Noramark, in small villages, so that to see this comparison and the opposition of rural and urban. So. Many of them, even if their stories are not here, went through the bitterness of this resistance before settling in Russia, Ukraine, or Europe and US. Loss of home is second narrative, trauma narrative. A shut door, memory on space and trauma. Trying to grasp generational trauma, I choose 4 pairs of key research participants, mother and daughter from each country. Laura and Karine, Russia, Rosa and Milena, Armenia, Raisa and oh my God, I'm trying to code. Okay, let's say Armenia in Masis, Jana and Elina in Nagorno-Karabakh Republic. Again, one family in Martuni, which is sort of rural place, and in Stepanakert, which is, let's say, capital city of Nagorno-Karabakh Republic, and Regina and Yulia Papian in the USA. Throughout history, Armenians had an influence on the city through monuments and architecture, for example, which has since been erased. Armenians have been removed from all the tourist literature. Most of their monuments have vanished, and their cemeteries have been vandalized and defaced. Very few said they would ever go back, even if they were allowed to, and those that expressed a curiosity to visit said they would only want to see the neighborhood where they lived, their schools, cemeteries, and promenade routes. Regina said with bitterness, they construct highway on our cemeteries. I don't want to go there to my home city of Baku. I don't want to see my family history erased under the asphalt. As a consequence of Yulia's hearing her mother and grandmother discuss traumatic experiences related to their family history, Yulia was obsessed with raising money to memorialize her family's struggles with a monument in Armenian church, in St. John's Armenian Church in Michigan. The shut door in this case means they have no way to go back, and this makes older generation feel even more frustrated and traumatized. The strategy of younger generation, 24 years old Yulia, is quite different. She's trying to actively do something in order to heal the memory of atrocities. Another challenge site is her new environment in the US, a mute, quote-unquote, conflict between old and new Armenian diasporas. She noted a disconnect between different groups of Armenians of greater Detroit area in Michigan. So rather than lament, as her mother and grandmother continue to do, she chose action over words. And the same story in Masis region. So Vika was, and in Nagorno-Karabakh the same. They just denied to accept this categorization like refugees or Azers or Gelma or all kind of stuff. So this is another section, is about the politics of difference. And Baku Armenians that came to Armenia had a hard time. One of the examples of both covertly at the earlier stage and overtly expressed co-ethnic interaction accompanied by intra-group tension was and is the case of Armenian refugees from Azerbaijan. In 1988-1991, in everyday life there were incidents of verbal clashes between Azerbaijani Armenians and Armenians of Armenia, as well as Azerbaijani Armenians and locals in Nagorno-Karabakh. Even though Nagorno-Karabakh is sort of, we can call it an ancestral nestle or diasporic, not diasporic, but ancestral homecoming. So these differences are really difficult to explain, but I will try. This, however, was not only spurred by the lack of enthusiasm of the Karabakh movement, but was also connected to the general level of poverty in Armenia and Nagorno-Karabakh, resulting from a painful economic transformation after collapse of the USSR and a devastating bloody ethnic war. As for Nagorno-Karabakh, the economic quote-unquote backwardness on rural region was harshly aggravated after 1988. It is cutting off of funds from Moscow. Poverty and lack of resources became essential for discrimination and exclusion of the expatriates. Despite belonging to one people, localism and nationalism, as well as the desperate search for survival, led to division among one people. Noteworthy here is that defining ethnic identities in terms of social interaction within and outside group boundaries rests on the logic of difference and belonging. Who belongs to the group and who does not? In a way, it is a process in which locals as one group distinguish themselves from Armenians, from Azerbaijan, to their advantage, and so instantiate in thought Azerbaijani Armenians as the other in this particular context. Difference is also organized hierarchically. This is not me, this is Bra, 1996. While Nagorno-Karabakh Armenians previously had a lower status than Azerbaijani Armenians and were perceived as poor, quote-unquote, and rustic, rural, now they appeared in a slightly elevated position by providing refuge to their own people who formerly had a better position, Dachniki, Garatskiye, urban. In Armenia, the struggle for proper identity runs even more deeply. Also, the body of the difference was constructed in linguistic otherness, Russian instead of Armenian, cosmopolitan and professional identities, urban lifestyle, and manners, especially gender behavior. Special derogatory names like upside-down Armenians, Gelma, Turkic word for newcomer, became a foundation for their everyday marginalizations and prejudice in Armenia and Nagorno-Karabakh, and in Russia they were called like Chernozhope, which means black people, and they also faced really vast amount of and multiple way of discrimination. So those are, especially in Armenia, was so ridiculous. Those are very, very small and differences, and if you go through them, this is like why these Armenians, they go to graveyard on May 2nd, they are so Soviet and Russian and stuff like this. And I will not go further, but explaining the roots of intra-group discrimination, I'm trying to do that, and to talk about linguistic chauvinism, but I think I have to skip this because I have only 3 minutes left. So I'm going just to come to because this is preliminary stage of research. Actually, I have hundreds of interviews, but I never focused on this transgenerational transmission of trauma. So in that case, in that sense, this is preliminary stage. So actually, language policy, I still have to say a couple of words about that. As for intra-group, intra-ethnic linguistic chauvinism towards Azerbaijani Armenians, the latter were locked in the swath of double-edged sword. In the new social conditions of Third Republic, neither Russian nor alternative Karabakhi dialect or Azerbaijani could serve as a positive social capital. That is to say that the stereotyping on the linguistic criteria had its overt nationalistic and hidden class connotations. Language policy in post-Soviet Armenia, a language legislature of 1993, became the body of intra-group discrimination toward refugees. And you can go further to learn about this in special literature. It brought them to the eventual decrease of both educational and educational status. Many refugee women worked as Russian language teachers in Azerbaijani cities, having very high status. Housing as a special factor should be also investigated because this is also a huge narrative. The professional niches the refugee occupied, some cases in Sevan, etc. Also, this is really rich case to look how they are othered. So summarizing the interviews, I came to the preliminary conclusions, and this is about the, in sense of theoretical umbrella, the traumatic narratives are discussed around the following topics: traumatic memory, there and then, versus here and now. This is really a huge topic. Loss of status, symbolic, human, economic capitals. Emotional losses, loss of native places, friends, neighbors. And there are two approaches and two strategies to cope with trauma. Nostalgic approach versus just denial of the place. So there is not such a place as Baku, because this doesn't look like before in previous time. There is no Baku like we remember. So loss of professional and real estate, loss of possession and real estate, loss of savings both in Soviet state banks and people banks, I mean defters, as I told. They would go to funerals and weddings, etc., and they lost all this network. This is the biggest loss. They lost network. And matrimonial strategies and matrimonial market completely changed in a negative way. So, and second conclusion is that the trauma Azerbaijani Armenians experienced by the atrocities and other genocidal behavior in Sumgait, Kirovabad and Baku, compounded by the trauma of verbal abuse and the sense of being second-rate citizens in their ancestral homeland, caused many to leave and never look back. And this story are still untold. And second is how these generations, these three generations, what strategies they choose for as a coping mechanism, as a coping to cope trauma. So in case of Yulia, she was kind of recovering through commemoration and erecting monument, so that to maybe get her mother forget about the graveyards under asphalt. And silencing is another coping strategy. And actually, and reaction on othering is also completely different. But let me stop here, and if you have questions, I will be happy to answer. Thank you very much.